Japan's rise as an economic, military, and technological power has been closely tied to its production of steel. Iron and steel, dirty as they are at the heart of modern technological innovation. Artisanal Japanese steelmaking is a cherished tradition, but as an industrial steel power, Japan needed to overcome serious shortcomings. They did. In this video, we look at the birth and early history of the Japanese steel industry and its national champion, Nippon Steel. But first, this video is brought to you by the Asianometry Patreon. Early access members get to see new videos first and selected references for those videos. Early access really helps me a lot, and I appreciate every pledge. Thanks, and on with the show. Much as in India, Japan's steel-making traditions date back to antiquity. The first things that might come to mind when we talk about Japanese steel are those memes, as well as the famous Japanese sword makers who produce steel weapons using the old ways, referred to as Katana. I have occasionally seen the process depicted in anime, but I have always been curious about how it actually works. It starts with people collecting iron sand from the rivers or mines up in the mountains. This sand, which contains far less iron than traditional iron ores, is concentrated to about 50 to 60% iron content using magnets. The sand is then heated up along with charcoal in a special clay furnace at about 1,200 to 1,500 degrees Celsius, lower than steel's melting point. To feed the flames, laborers will blow air into the furnace by hand using bellows. After about a week, we break open the clay furnace to pull out the grand prize, a large ingot of blister steel referred to as a kara. Inside this ingot will be pieces of workable steel referred to as tamahagane, or literally speaking, mother of steel. Iron workers can then shear off the tamahagane and distribute it to the 300 or so professional sword makers around the country. The sword makers make the swords in a series of painstaking steps. Pieces of tamahagane are hammered into a plate, which is then wrapped in paper and heated up in a furnace. The resulting steel block is then folded over about 10 to 15 times to create the sword along with its distinctive patterns. I guess that explains the origin of the meme. This laborious process makes a beautiful product, no doubt, but it was no way at all economical. The single massive ingot, the kara, consumes about 8 to 9 tons of iron sand and 11 to 13 tons of charcoal. A modern reconstruction of the process found that, even with the help of electrically powered bellows, a single kara costs about $100,000 in $1970, 100 times more expensive than modern steel. In order to produce far more steel, the Western countries switched over to a familiar two-step process. In the first step, you combine iron ore and a high-carbon fuel known as coke in a blast furnace to produce pig iron at the bottom. This pig iron is a high-carbon intermediary product between steel and iron. After that, you can refine it into crude and finished steel products. These can then be used for construction, munitions, birthday parties, whatever have you. So keep in mind there are two separate items being produced here, pig iron and steel, and two industries making them. There are factories that make and sell pig iron to the steel makers who then make steel from it. Then there are integrated makers who will make both, taking in raw iron ore and selling finished steel at the end. When Matthew Perry came to Japan in the 1850s, the country's steel industry was nothing more than scattered artisanal furnaces. Thousands of steel masters working all day could not produce enough steel for the country's needs, and without enough steel, Japan cannot produce enough cannons and weapons to fight off invaders. After the chaos of the Meiji Restoration, the new government's main industrial policy was to build up its military capacity and industrial output. Steel was correctly judged to be at the heart of its transformation, but there were some issues. In 1875, the Japanese government began work on the Kamaishi Ironworks, the country's oldest Western-style iron factory. At its peak, the Kamaishi works, made of a British design, produced about 5,000 tons of pig iron. Its two 25-ton blast furnaces were supplied with iron sands from the nearby mine, as well as charcoal as its high-carbon source. This was a time of great experimentation. the Japanese government was setting up a variety of state-owned enterprises in cotton, silk, shipping, shipbuilding. Many of these SOEs were not profitable. The Kamaishi was one of those unprofitable SOEs. Just 95 days after startup, the factory suffered a massive fire in its charcoal facilities. Then the second blast furnace had to be shut down due to charcoal supply shortages. What the heck? So in 1882, the government sent an inspector to review the raw goods issue. Their report detailed problems not only in finding enough wood to produce the necessary charcoal, but also serious deficiencies in the iron sands. At the start, it was just assumed that the area was rich in both iron and charcoal. So the British, based on this feedback from the Japanese and unfamiliar with the landscape, designed a big blast furnace to accommodate. Blast furnaces can be quite efficient, but they are delicate and need to be constantly fed with the right raw materials. So, when the inspector estimated that Kamaishi mine's iron deposits at a minuscule 130,000 tons, it was quite deflating. Pessimistic, the government sold off the ironworks, only to throw a fit when the entrepreneur who bought them, Chobei Tanaka, a former army food merchant, proved everyone wrong and made the Kamaishi profitable in the 1890s. As Japan industrialized, it continued to import most of the pig iron and rolled steel for laying down rail and building textile factories. Proposals for other government-owned domestic steelworks cropped up, but were rejected due to cost. But then came the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895. When the war first broke out, the British embargoed all arms bound for Japan through Singapore. This embargo caused shortages threatening the war effort. Nevertheless, the Japanese defeated the Qing, forcing the latter to sue for peace. Reflecting on the shortages and riding a wave of nationalist patriotism, the Japanese government proposed a new domestic iron and steel factory. Feeding off of Japan's own supply of iron sands, the integrated factory's production was intended to replace pig iron imports and build up Japanese military capacity. Thus, we have the Yawata Steel Works, sometimes also called the Imperial Steelworks. Japan commissioned the plants designed from Germany, importing German technology to stock it. They made this choice, assuming that German technology was both the most up-to-date and the most suitable for manufacturing many steel types. Yawata was sited at a small village, Yawata Village, ergo the name, in the Fukuoka prefecture at Kyushu Island. They chose it for its geographical protections, nearby coal field, sea transportation, large labor force, and plentiful water. The plant first fired up in February 1901, interestingly, just a month before J.P. Morgan created the once mighty U.S. Steel Corporation. And like with U.S. Steel, at the time of its founding, Yawata was the country's biggest company, employing nearly 5,000 blue and white collar workers. Yawata, funded in small part with reparations from the losing Qing Empire, marks the beginning of the modern Japanese steel industry. Its 90,000-ton capacity in 1901 rivaled that of the foreign steelmakers at the time. The end of the First Sino-Japanese War heralded a massive economic boom, and with that, iron and steel consumption hit unprecedented levels. In 1893, Japan used about 37,938 and 65,618 tons of iron and steel, respectively. 3 years later, that had grown to 63,596 tons of iron and 179,946 tons of steel. Most of this steel was used for buildings, railroads, and random plates and rods. Almost all of the iron and steel was imported. Yawata should have benefited from this huge demand, but the Japanese plans, perhaps seeking too eagerly to match Western scale, were too ambitious. The German-made designs did not match the coke from Japanese coke ovens and the quality of the coke it produced, which impeded progress. Over time, and after massive trial and error, the Japanese engineers reworked all of the machinery to better fit Japan's raw materials. Finding the local iron sands insufficient, Yawata was forced to change the original plan and import iron ore from abroad. One big move after the First Sino-Japanese War was Japan's first iron supply contract with China, an agreement to exchange 40,000 tons of Japanese coke for 50,000 tons of iron ore from the Da-Ye iron mines in Hebei province each year for 15 years starting in 1898. The Japanese government helpfully abolished import tariffs on these cheaply mined Chinese iron ores. Japanese banks like Mitsui also lent millions of yen to the Chinese mine operator Han Ye-ping. 60% of Yawata's iron came from China. A second major source of iron ore was added with the Japanese colonization of Korea. Their workable deposits were not in enormous quantities, but were easily mined in enough quantities to fuel Yawata and the other various steelworks sprouting up in Japan. Japan spent and fought for these for several reasons. First, but less so, they wanted to build industrial capacity. Second, they wanted to deny access to the Europeans, like the British or the Germans. The cost of iron and steel is highly dependent on the cost of raw iron ore and coke, so these arrangements gave Yawata a powerful advantage. Pig iron from Yawata was quoted at 23 yen per ton, while the privately run kamaishis was 27 yen. Another major development favoring Yawata occurred in 1904 when Japan fought a war with the Russian Empire. The Russo-Japanese War not only sparked immense demand for more steel for munitions, but it also pushed the government to double the factory's capacity to 180,000 tons of finished steel product. Yawata Steel began going into Japanese military munitions and vehicles. In 1906, Yawata represented over 90% of the country's domestic steel output. And then, in 1910, Yawata turned its first profit, 52,000 yen. I say profit because it was calculated using the same definition used by today's Silicon Valley startups, before dividends, interest, or depreciation. Before then, the government had invested 37 million yen, and the venture had lost a cumulative 11.1 million yen. The government did want the factory to turn a profit, and they constantly pushed it to do so. But Yawata's government ties had thrown it into a dilemma. Those ties grew it into a titan and guaranteed its access to cheap ores, but it also linked the company to the specter of military aggression and imperial conquest, forcing it to uphold the explicitly non-commercial goals the government wanted it to. World War I grew immense demand for iron and steel products for use in machinery, munitions, and ships. Military expenditure grew 3 times over from 823 million yen in 1913 to 3 billion yen in 1919. Machinery output grew almost 7 times over, from 111 million tons in 1913 to 716 million in 1919. Finished steel demand grew from 751,000 tons in 1913 to 1.1 million tons in 1919. At the same time, the war greatly disrupted steel imports into Japan. Germany basically ended all exports for some unknown reason. The US then tried to make up for it until some other unknown thing happened a few years later. Japanese shipbuilders in particular suffered what they called a steel famine, so Yawata and the rest of the Japanese steel industry frantically built up domestic supply. Yawata embarked on the third major expansion plan to double up their capacity from its existing 350,000 tons of steel to 650,000 tons. This expansion was controversial. The other privately owned steel makers complained about Yawata potentially oversupplying the market and urged to cooperate, not compete with them. In response, the government passed a new law in 1917, the Iron and Steel Business Promotion Law. It gave tax breaks on equipment imported by smaller steel makers, and Yawata also started selling some of its pig iron to outside domestic steel makers. It was a great shift in Japanese industrial policy. Previously, the government spent its resources boosting its state-owned corporation, basically Yawata. We can argue that these efforts had not succeeded in achieving the policy goals. Yawata dominated the domestic iron and steel markets, with a staggering 85% market share in 1913. But considering the overall dearth of domestic output, in 1913, 2/3 of Japan's steel demand had to be satisfied via imports. That dominance was not something to be proud of. But after the law, the government shifted to the idea of promoting the steel industry as a whole, and with that, the entire industry took a big step forward, with private industry leading the way. By 1919, Yawada's share of the domestic market, which was 75% as late as 1916, fell to just 51%. Startups began building, seeking to take advantage of the favorable economic environment. Just as those factories entered production, the war ended. The end of World War I ushered in a decade of economic difficulty. Munitions demand fell off a cliff, in part due to the cancellation of a big Navy fleet expansion. From 1922 to 1925, Yawada only got 8% of the Navy orders they had been promised. As is the case with any high capital expenditure industry, idle plants, like hands, are a disaster. Yawada pivoted hard into civil construction projects and railroads, bars, rods, pipes, sheets, etc. This intensified competition in the wider steel market. Upstream, the Japanese iron industry faced the challenge of Indian pig iron exports. 80% of the pig iron in Japan was imported, and half of that came from India. The steel makers, desperate for any margin they could take, snapped up this cheap pig iron. This forced the Japanese pig iron factories, including the aforementioned Kamaishi Iron Works, to consolidate, joining Japan's big business conglomerates, the Zaibatsu. By 1924, the entire iron and steel industry had joined either Mitsui, Mitsubishi, or Yawada. The government then encouraged cartels in the pig iron and finished steel industries to stabilize prices. That sort of worked. But the fundamental underlying issue was that there were still too many small furnaces and no economies of scale. In 1926, all of Japan produced less steel than Luxembourg, 1.5 million tons to 2.2 million. Without difficult rationalization, this situation will persist. After the war, Japan fell into a great economic depression. These difficulties were for several reasons: a questionable return to the gold standard, as well as heavy debt from the Kanto earthquake. Export values fell 50%. Workers' real incomes fell 30%. Over 3 million Japanese fell unemployed, forcing families to sell their daughters into the brothels. In 1931, Japan began its idiotic campaigns of military aggressions, beginning with the false flag Manchurian incident, as well as the subsequent invasion and conquest of the northeastern regions of China. Back home in the steel industry, the gentleman's agreement, i.e. cartel, between importers and domestic industry holding up the pig iron market fell apart. Pig iron prices crashed 35% from 1929 to 1931. So in 1931, the government attempted to merge together all of Japan's iron and steel makers, calling it an industrial rationalization. The Mitsui Zaibatsu supported this idea. Its steel arm was fully integrated, making both iron and steel, so they were hit very hard by the pig iron crash. It was financially to their advantage to consolidate. But Yawada, along with the powerful privately owned Nippon Steel Tube Company and other non-integrated steel makers, were against it. In particular, they doubted the combined company's financial viability, so that particular proposal didn't go through. Things changed. In 1932, the government passed a tariff on pig iron. Prime Minister Korekiyo Takahashi took Japan back off the gold standard, causing the yen to plummet in value, but restoring economic growth. These positive developments reversed Iwata's previous resistance to consolidation. Thus, on February 28, 1933, the government passed a law merging Yawada with 5 of Japan's private iron and steel companies to create the Japan and Iron Steel Corporation. I shall refer to this company as Japan Iron and Steel to distinguish it from one of its descendants, Nippon Steel. They are distinctively different entities. At its founding, the company controlled over 95% of the country's pig iron, 56% of Japan's crude ingot steel production, and 52% of finished steel. The lower market shares when it came to steel were due to several large private steel companies declining to join in due to issues over valuation. The Japan Iron and Steel Corporation was a weird private-public amalgamation. On first glance, this new company was a state-run steel monopoly. For instance, it was over 50% owned by the government. It was also beholden to the government ministry's commands and or veto. However, it was also a private corporation and deliberately set up as such for maximum flexibility to achieve the industry's rationalization and catch up with the West. It was why Yawata agreed to the whole thing in the first place, to free itself from the constraints of public oversight. Japan Steel, along with the privately owned Japan Steel Tube Company, was the cornerstone of the Japanese steel industry, and at its core was the original plant near Yawata Village in Kyushu. By 1945, it alone would represent a third of Japan's entire iron and steel capacity. As Japan fell deeper into militarism throughout the 1930s, the industry expanded their capacity to prepare for war. It was clear very early on that the Japanese steel and war machines depended on imports of iron and coal. With Britain controlling pig iron imports from India, the military government forced all-out exploitation of the colony's resources in Korea, Manchukuo, and northern China. In 1938, the military government passed the mobilization law over extreme business opposition. This gave them unlimited control to set prices, regulate activity, wages, build stockpiles, and the like. And then in mid-1940, the military government made the poor decision to invade Southeast Asia. A year later, it attacked Pearl Harbor, triggering the Pacific War. They gambled on a short war and lost. By 1942, Allied blockades began choking off supplies flowing into Japan. Imports of the home islands totaled 10.12 million tons in 1940. Much of that had been badly needed Chinese iron ores. 2 years later, that had fallen to 8.74 million. Sunk transport capacity took their toll. Yet despite these major setbacks and shortcomings, the military government ordered their Japanese steel industry to provide 10 million tons of steel by 1944. Just to compare, in 1941, the industry delivered 4.5 million tons, and that was largely prior to the start of the Pacific War. 10 million tons was so far from realistic that it might be downright insane. When actual production fell short of goals, the government admitted a new path was necessary. They devolved administrative control to a trade association run by the steel company's managers, a forerunner of business-government relations after the war. Production improved to new heights in 1943, but it would not last. The blockade was working, and orders to stockpile before the Pacific War were not properly followed. Cut off from their mines in China, the Japanese began frantically mining inferior ores in northeast Korea, closer to Japan and perceived to be easier to bring home. They also reopened those old-fashioned iron sand mines in the home islands. What was old is new again. 1943 marked the peak of Japanese steel production. By December 1944, actual production was just 43% of capacity. Japan's steel industry was slowly starving to death. Steel is the foundation of war production. Its shortages greatly impacted the war effort and by proxy civilian life. By December 1944, 20% of new merchant ships were made from wood, a real throwback. Residential home construction halted. Only 10% of planned dorms and houses were completed in 1942. The price of iron kettles and saucepans soared nearly 10 times over in the black markets from December 1943 to July 1945, and let us not even talk about bicycles. In 1944, the Allies identified Yawata steel mills and its critical coking plants as a strategic target. They carried out 3 major bombing runs on Yawata. The first 2 attacks in June and August 1944 did minimal damage to the complex and its coking plants, though there was some damage to the nearby city. Allied intelligence later decided to focus on other targets, correctly reasoning that it would be difficult to blow up all the Japanese steel factories. Plus, the factories would be useless anyway without imported ores, which Japan did not have. Much later, though, the Allies did a third firebombing run near the war's end, just 2 days after the Hiroshima atomic bombing. This run killed or injured 2,500 people and destroyed 20% of Yawata City. Hard to say from the histories, but it seems like the steel factory and its workers again largely survived. But the smoke rising from the city's ruins in the wake of that firebombing run saved its neighbor Kokura from being made the target of the second atomic bomb. At the end of World War II, the Japanese steel industry laid in ruins. Damage directly done to the individual steel facilities had not been actually that heavy, but the war and surrender deprived the Japanese steel industry of its major ore and coal mines in Korea and mainland China. Without those captive reserves, and no foreign exchange to buy new ones, the factories fell silent. In fact, why bother at all? There began talk of letting the iron and steel industries go entirely. One Osaka cotton spinning executive said point blank to a steel executive, "Since Japan does not have any iron ore nor coal, she does not need her costly iron and steel industry. Our cotton spinning firms will build the Japanese economy through exports." It was not an uncommon sentiment, but they were, of course, wrong. And thankfully, Japan did not abandon their steel industry. Instead, they did the opposite. The stage is set for a magnificent comeback. But let's save that story for another video in another time. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the Patreon, and I'll see you guys next time.